At the exact moment the ring fell into the fire, 9 ancient kings, wearing nothing but shadow and the memory of crowns, simply stopped existing. Not fled, not defeated in battle. Erased all at once, the instant the thing that had sustained them for 3,000 years was gone. Tonight we don't ask how the war was won. We ask what it actually means to be built entirely out of someone else's power, and to disappear the moment that power does. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the Nazgûl's ending is stranger and sadder than almost any death in this entire story. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe before we go any further. New episodes go up every day. To understand what happens to the Nazgûl at the end, you first have to understand what they'd actually become by then, which is stranger and sadder than servants of Sauron quite captures. Each of them had once been a king in his own right, with a name, a bloodline, a kingdom that loved or feared him for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone else's will. The rings Sauron gave them promised more years, more permanence, a chance to finish what mortal lifespans usually cut short. What those rings actually did, slowly and patiently, was hollow each king out and refill the space with something that answered only to Sauron. By the time the story we know begins, there's no meaningful difference left between the Witch King's will and Sauron's will operating at a slight distance. They were never really 9 separate people anymore. They were 9 extensions of one. That's worth sitting with, because it explains something the story rarely stops to name directly. The Nazgûl don't fear death the way ordinary soldiers do. They can't really be killed in the way a man can be killed, because there's very little independent them left to kill. What holds them together isn't flesh or blood. It's Sauron's will, poured into them so long ago and so thoroughly that they've become something closer to instruments than individuals. A blade might unmake the physical form one of them is wearing for a while. It doesn't touch the actual thing sustaining their existence, because that thing was never really inside their bodies to begin with. It was always, quietly, somewhere else. This is why the fight at the Pelennor Fields plays out the way it does. When the Witch King finally falls, struck down by hands that weren't supposed to be capable of harming him, it's genuinely devastating, genuinely a turning point in the battle. But it isn't the end of what he is. His physical form is gone, but the will animating it doesn't originate with him. It flows backward, all the way to Barad-dûr, to the same source sustaining all 9 of them. Killing the vessel matters enormously for the war. It doesn't sever the connection. Only one thing could ever actually do that, and it's the same thing that decides almost everything else in this story. The ring itself. Picture the exact moment Frodo's ring goes into the fire, from the Nazgûl's side of that instant, rather than the Hobbits. Whatever remained of 9 kings, scattered across battlefields and towers, and the darkening sky above Minas Tirith, wasn't simply defeated. It was unplugged. Sauron's power, the single thread holding together everything they'd become across 3,000 years of slow corrosion, vanished all at once, and there was nothing underneath it to catch them. No original self left intact enough to survive on its own once the borrowed power disappeared. No kingdom to return to, no bloodline to remember them as anything other than what they'd become. Just absence, arriving all at once, in every place any of them happened to be standing. There's something almost unbearably lonely in imagining that moment honestly. Whatever consciousness, whatever fragment of the men they'd once been still existed somewhere inside all that borrowed power, experienced its own ending not as a battle lost, but as a foundation simply ceasing to exist beneath them, all at once, with no warning and no mercy attached to the timing. And this is where the story becomes genuinely strange to sit with, because it raises a question most retellings skip past entirely. What actually happened to them? In whatever sense, them still meant anything by that point. Tolkien is careful never to describe their ending as a death in the ordinary sense. There are no bodies, no graves, no funeral rites, because there was no one left who considered them worth mourning, and perhaps because there was genuinely nothing left in a form that could be mourned. They simply weren't, where a moment before they had been. The wind carried away whatever their screams had been made of, and the story moves on without them, the way it never quite manages to move on from characters who die in ways the story actually witnesses and grieves. That absence of grief is worth noticing, because it tells you something true about what they'd already lost, long before the ring's destruction made it visible. A death gets mourned because there's a person whose absence creates a wound in the people who loved them. The Nazgûl had no one left to create that wound in. Whatever kingdoms once mourned these 9 men had crumbled and been forgotten centuries earlier, precisely because Sauron's rings had already stolen their names and stories long before anyone got around to stealing their lives. Their actual deaths, when they finally came, were almost a formality. The real ending had already happened, slowly, 1 century at a time, back when 9 kings first decided that more time was worth any price at all. Maybe that's the real tragedy hiding underneath their disappearance, easy to miss beneath the relief of the war finally ending. We tend to imagine villains getting a dramatic final defeat, a moment where evil is confronted and answers for what it's done. The Nazgûl never get that. They don't get punished. They don't get redeemed. They simply stop, the way a puppet stops moving the instant the hand controlling it lets go, because that's genuinely all that was left of them by the end. Not evil incarnate, finally facing justice. Just 9 borrowed lives, spent entirely in service of someone else's will, ending the exact instant that will had nothing left to spend them on. Somewhere, in whatever accounting the story never quite gets around to making, there were once 9 separate childhoods, 9 separate kingdoms, 9 separate reasons someone might have loved each of those men before the rings ever found them. None of that survived long enough to matter by the time the story finally lets them go. And maybe that, more than any battle or any blade, is the real horror the ring was always capable of. Not turning people evil, simply erasing, patiently and thoroughly enough, everything about them that could have ever been anything else. If this story moved you, there are more waiting. Quiet corners of Middle-earth that history remembers but rarely feels. Subscribe and walk them with us.